This is Justice Worriers, a podcast where we think about things that are right and wrong in our world and how Christian ideas can help us respond to them. We prefer hard questions over easy answers, and we'd love you to join us in our ramblings. Listen in and contact us using the links in the show notes. Hello and welcome to Justice Worriers episode 45. My name's Andy and as usual I'm joined by Leah. Say hi, Leah.
Hi there.
And Jörg. Say hi, Jörg.
Hello.
And today we're going to just have a chat about freedom. We got talking about freedom and what we really mean by freedom and whether we're free in kind of capitalist democratic societies, and then also the word freedom comes up a lot in Christian discussions and in the Bible, and what does it really mean? So we're going to get into that, but we're going to start off with our homework because we actually set ourselves some homework this time.
Yay!
Jörg, I'm going to go to you first because I know you did it.
Mm-hmm.
So our homework was to carry out a free act or an act of freedom. What happened, Jörg?
What happened? So, I mean, I went through the week thinking, well, it's impossible. You're always connected to something. And, you know, what is free anyway? This idea of free will. Well, actually, it seems to be, we can always point to causation in our brains, hormones, whatever. So what's freedom? But then I woke up this morning and I picked up my phone just to see the news. And I fell into this horrendous Human Rights Watch report that was on this morning about atrocious murder of children in the conflict in Sudan. Really don't want to go into the details, but it's horrendous. It just speaks to this forgotten conflict. And then it was time for me to get up, and I shut down my phone and I went over to my tranquil college that I happened to be rooming at during the week, and there the choir was singing down from the tower because it was Ascension Day, and we had this lovely service in the sun. And then I went into hall and had a good English breakfast. I realized that was my act of freedom. The ability to walk away from something like that when others don't. And it really points to all that's difficult around the notion of freedom, because there is a way in which you could read freedom as sort of a severing of ties, freeing yourself from something. And in truth is, I'm not free. I'm still haunted by those images. I'm haunted by the silence. And I don't know how to reconcile justice and freedom in that particular episode. So it got worse, I guess, but I've done my homework.
Well done. That's the main thing.
Not really, but and we managed to sync this episode very early on that way as well.
So we can't. It's only up from here. Leah, did you do your homework?
No, I never do I? So, I exercise my free and democratic right not to do what I was told, and I didn't do my homework. No, but I did have a little thought about freedom as I was feeding the chickens this morning, and we have this huge, great big bin with these like dry chicken pellets that they eat, and every now and then when I'm scooping it out, then I realise the chickens are going to get like an extra, like kind of little snack, because essentially what happens is slugs have an amazing ability to find food, don't they? And they sneak into the bin somehow, and they live this amazing life of gorging themselves on this, you know, a bounteous supply of food, but it's so dry and that it literally just desiccates them. And so what you find, to sort of the chicken's delight and the slug's sadness, are these little dried up, shriveled, totally desiccated slugs. And it made me think about their whole essence is gone, but yeah, they died happy. They were gorging themselves on food, and they were exercising their free right to eat. It's a very sad tale of slug hell or slug heaven, depending on which way you look at it. But yeah, I'm sorry.
It's just the darkest episode of Justice Warriors yet.
Well, we managed to make Resurrection quite dark, so I think we're now making Freedom quite dark. Is that?
I didn't think Resurrection was dark, but yeah. Anyway, I'm still stuck on that. But that's another topic. I still like Resurrection.
So I completely forgot about this homework. I didn't think about it at all. But fortunately, something did happen to me this week that's kind of an act of freedom in a way, which was I've been thinking a lot about the I don't really know how to put it, but kind of, I guess, the weight of other people's expectations on me, or my own taking on of rules and laws into my being, especially from my Christian childhood. And I had a kind of moment of lightness, and I was listening to a song that I really like that is a real rejection of rules and stuff. I was listening to it and walking along, and I felt this great defiance in myself and this throwing off of the burden of it's hard to say what the burden is. It's kind of the burden of other people's expectations, but it's all created by me, so it's not really those other people at all. It's my kind of projection of those people, or of the God that I believed in when I was a young child, or something. All that stuff wrapped together. But I had like a moment of resisting those shackles. But I wasn't free at all, right? None of it's gone. I just had a moment of feeling like I wanted it to be.
Interesting.
That's a start, right?
Start to what? Like, who would Andy be without those shackles? It's interesting.
Yeah, I mean, the reason why that came to mind particularly was just before we started recording, we were just talking about bits in the Bible that mention freedom, and there's this one about, I think you said it was from Galatians, Jörg. It was for freedom that Christ set us free. And it's talking about telling people not to get circumcised and not to join the kind of the Jewish law if they weren't already a Jew and they're becoming a Christian. And that kind of sense that the law is pressing on you and is a negative thing is something that's very real for me. I have this sense of this, not the same law, but this law of essentially the idea that you're a snivelling worm and God can't look at you, so you need Jesus to be in the way so that God can bear to even look in your direction. Weighs very heavy on me. So I'm attracted to the idea of that freedom.
Right.
Yeah, it's interesting because I grew up with a sort of similar but slightly different feeling. The sort of like the snivelling worm thing in a way, but more this sense that there were lots of things that I didn't like about myself, and whether those were things that society told me weren't right about me or that I just didn't like about myself. And a lot of them were around kind of kind of self-control and things that I did kind of, in the heat of the moment that I wished I hadn't done. And part of them were about society's expectations of how girls behave, and there was an amount of that, but there was just this sort of expectation of how you ought to behave, and I remember just like desperately holding on to these verses and these things in the Bible about being set free,
right?
And to me that meant being set free from this person that I was, that I didn't want to be. And I now look back on it and I think, actually, what a shame, because a lot of who that person is just who I am, and whilst I'm never going to pretend I'm in any way perfect, or that there aren't ways that I could behave that are better, it's very hard to tread that line of freedom in a positive sense. Because I just thought at some point I was going to have this experience of the Holy Spirit, because that's what my church taught, that would make me born again, so that I wouldn't any longer be this person that I didn't like being.
Yeah.
And that was freedom as far as the church taught me. And you know, I'm still waiting for that to happen. But I'm not really anymore, because I've decided I'm not actually that bothered.
Yeah, I think the analysis that I was giving earlier is kind of how I'm trying to see it now. But I think I very much saw it the way you were describing how you saw it for a long time. Yeah,
I think for me, I was born again, if you want to use that language, as a child, and it was a really strange experience of that your sins no longer matter. The things you're doing badly no longer matter. And I would have been 7 or something, you know, and you were taught with these kind of flannel pictures, and like, you know, you kind of believe these very simple truths about, and we've talked about this, you know, how Jesus makes your heart white, and all these kind of pictures. But I remember distinctly, you know, it was the same feeling as if you were in trouble as a child, and all of a sudden you were welcomed back into the fold, right? You were forgiven. It was good now. That joy, that reconciliation, that completeness. And I am not sure that I find this feeling responsible. And this brings back to the story that I was saying, right? So this idea, like, what do we proclaim when we say these sins no longer matter? As a German, I'm very familiar with national guilt, and what does it say that this is all now forgiven and past? Or what does it mean that I could leave certain parts of my past behind in East Germany, and now I'm free to travel around? That is a responsibility, and in some ways an injustice, because I got out and others didn't from their particular cages. So it just this kind of like this individualized, you're good now, like all of this has held you back no longer matters. So like, you know, it wasn't even so connected to my psychology in that sense, but this like irresponsibility is like all is gone now.
It's very, very individualistic, isn't it? It's your sin is all centered on you and your character and your personality and you as a person. And that is what Jesus has come to set you free from, to make you a better version of yourself.
Right.
So that you can then go on and bless other people. So it's not, you know, it's not entirely focused on the self, but the initial freedom is very much you are free. You know, and on the flip side, there are definitely spiritual experiences that I've had in my life that have enabled me to be a different kind of person, and have enabled me to be free from certain sorts of behaviour, because things have been healed that were hurting, and I don't, you know, there are circumstances where I don't react out of that pain anymore because something happened, and I can point to specific times when that happened. So, and that, it's always that tricky thing between the individual and the collective, isn't it? You can't fix the problems of the world if you don't fix individual people.
Right, yeah.
Leaving aside the fact that you ever fix anything, but you know what I mean. You can't begin anything if you don't begin with people as individuals. But yet you can't leave it there, and you can't entirely define freedom based on what I experience as an individual. So maybe it's a truth, but just a partial truth, and we've got a bit fixated on it.
Yeah, I like that because I mean, in our pre-discussion, Andy asked me like, well, what's the alternative? Like, stay in bed and wallow in that pain that's in front of you, and that doesn't do anything either, right? So we are locked together in this history, and then how do you go on acting? And you think of our young people and like the feeling that they get that their degrees of freedom are being limited by climate crisis all the way down to Brexit, and then the answer can only be to still keep doing good. But it's still, I mean, I'm still sort of really held back by these very shallow notions of freedom that we carry with us. that either have to do with like your past no longer matters, or you can act as you please.
Justify those that die by wearing the badge, they're the chosen whites. Those who died are justified for wearing the badge, they're the chosen whites. To justify those that died, they're the chosen whites.
So if we continue to understand freedom as freedom from sin, but we expand our understanding of sin to include not just individual sin, but also the sins that our society is committing, and that the global injustice and things that are reflections of that sin or expressions of that sin. What would freedom? In what sense has Christ set us free? What is freedom, or would freedom be from that sin?
So are you in the territory of like Romans 8 then, where you're talking about people who've known some kind of individual freedom are like the first fruits? They're like the beginning of this change that's happening in the world. They're left with a sense of groaning and a sense of longing for things to be different, but they do have an ability to start bringing about that change. I mean, I really like that chapter for that sort of duality of the here but not yet here kind of. Am I on the? I'm just going to check I'm even in the right chapter, but I think I am.
No, you are. Yeah.
Okay, so it's like a glimpse of like even being able to imagine freedom is what we have now, something like that.
Well, imagine redemption, right? I mean, that's what it's about. This idea that you're not held back, but you by the way the world is, but you see this as labor pains, as groaning for the day when the Lord will appear. But you start with verse 18. I consider that our present sufferings are not worth comparing with the glory that will be revealed in us. The creation waits in eager expectations for the sons of God to be revealed, or the children of God. For the creation was subjected to frustration, not by its own choice, but by the will of the one who subjected it, in hope that the creation itself would be liberated from its bondage to decay and brought into the glorious freedom of the children of God.
It sounds like Gillian of Norwich. Like she really wrestles with it. She's like, I know that it will all get sorted out, but I just can't see how.
Yeah, I mean, the next verses as well, we know that the whole creation has been groaning as in the pains of childbirth right up to the present time. Not only so, but we ourselves, who have the first fruits of the Spirit, groan inwardly as we wait eagerly for our adoption to sonship, the redemption for our bodies.
But hope that is seen is no hope at all. Who hopes for what he already has? So freedom is a kind of a hope in something that we proclaim, that we don't see. And what do we purchase with that? An idea of a real severing? Like, only Christ is going to come at the end of days and make everything all right. So we just hold out.
That's what Gillian of Norwich seems to be going for.
I mean, I see one thing in there, and it also links back to what Jesus says about freedom in John 8. Very biblical today, aren't we? It's interesting. But when he talks about you shall know the truth and the truth shall set you free, his disciples turn to him and say, well, we're descendants of Abraham, we've never been slaves to anyone, which is not true. The descendants of Abraham have been enslaved many times, but it's like this national pride. And Jesus says, I tell you the truth, and they obviously need it. Everyone who sins is a slave to sin. Now, a slave has no permanent place in the family, but a son belongs to it forever. Like, there's a lot of language to unpack here. Also, given the sort of slightly ambiguous stance of the New Testament towards slavery, actual slavery. But this idea that you're enslaved by what comes before, that you can only hate because you see hatred, that you can only believe in murder because that's what you see. I think that's a kind of a freedom that enables you to act differently, to act creatively, and I see a lot in that. I was supervising an essay a student wrote on apartheid and the sort of discussion that the church had under apartheid, like what the right reaction is. And there were some people who proclaimed the third way and say, like, how do we challenge apartheid without being overly political. And that was, of course, part of the problem that other people were criticizing. But there's a lot of then, like, what does Jesus mean when he says, when somebody forces you to go 1 mile, go with him another mile? And the one point this one theologian was making, by the name of Walter Wink, was very interesting. He says, you're exercising a degree of freedom in that moment that you say, sure, I'll go another mile with you. And you're kind of speaking toward that enslavement by saying, well, I'll top it up one. I'm going to respond to this. I'm not going to be held by your hatred toward me that you think you can command me around. I'm going to turn this into an act of love toward you. And I mean, that's an interesting concept of freedom, I think, that you're not responding one-to-one to the situation.
Yeah, there's a taking there, isn't there? Taking of control. Similar to how we talked about Mary taking the ability to accept her calling when it wasn't really offered to her.
Well, when she wasn't really given an alternative. Yeah. I mean,
she wasn't given a choice, and she responds as if she was.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Yes, freedom in unexpected places where you wouldn't expect to find it. Like we were talking about, the generosity versus the scarcity mindset. The freedom to choose generosity even though you don't have much yourself, and the freedom to act with small acts of kindness in ways that would surprise people who just think that everybody's going to be out for themselves.
I see some kind of parallel there. I was just thinking about, while these were both talking about, like, the question I asked of, like, what is this freedom that we supposedly have? Like, where would we see it if it existed? And, like, the freedom to love your enemies, for example, to engage in peace talks with people who are completely demonized to you and achieve. Sometimes people do have peace talks and achieve peace with people who are, who they see, well, they're supposed to see as completely non-human. Sometimes that actually happens, and that feels like maybe some of this, this first fruits, like breaking through, or this, ability to imagine happening.
And I struggle with that, because what I see nowadays quite often is that peace talks are just another arrow in the toolkit of those people who want to just get the other one. Like, I see this in Ethiopia. You could also think about what happened earlier this week in the sort of ceasefire proposal that was accepted at the last minute in Israel, Gaza, and didn't lead to peace. And it was like the sort of the being very, very tactical with how peace is being negotiated and considered is exactly the antithesis of this. So we have a lot of these kind of very uneasy truce or peace, and maybe that is how they normally are done, and maybe it's the sort of the idealism of the 1990s with walls coming everywhere that you thought that another world was possible, and actually we found out it really wasn't. But except for some quite profound changes in terms of the mobility of individual citizens like myself and whole countries, but not in the total change of system, or that somehow the world got more peaceful or something.
It feels to me like there's a sort of, like, almost an industrialization of, it felt very optimistic to me that things like the United Nations existed, and that kind of approach of essentially loving our enemies was like being institutionalized. And then I agree, Jörg, what feels like's happened is that once it becomes an institution, it's then kind of open to manipulation, and it no longer is the thing that it was before it got institutionalized.
Yeah. And I mean, there were beautiful examples. If you think of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission in South Africa, and they were contested and still are, but to some extent that was the attempt to institutionalize that kind of freedom, that the past acts are not going to define us. And same in Rwanda, in even more atrocious circumstances after that sort of slaughter, that people were encouraged to reconcile with one another. When you dig in, it gets very difficult. But the idea is strangely captivating, that you're not held by that past, that it isn't all that defines you.
And talking about being free of sin makes sense in that context.
And to some, I was just thinking, because our last episode was on the resurrection. I mean, this is what the resurrection means to me as well. It's that God saying, I'm not bound by your hate. I'm not bound by your murderous character and nature. I'm free from that. And I think that's the radical idea behind the resurrection, theologically speaking.
Well, that's that thing. I'm free to come back, and I'm free not to exact my revenge.
Yeah.
I guess is what you were saying last time, wasn't it?
But that freedom is also so otherworldly and strange, that I'm free to go through walls, and I'm free to appear in different ways. And there's a lot of real, it's a very otherworldly freedom. So in a sense, we're back to what you said earlier with Romans 8. We just have these kind of glimpses and hopes that freedom exists, right? And today being Ascension Day, we actually mark the end of of those Jesus appearances, right? So that wasn't institutionalized, that didn't keep happening.
And now you do what they tell you. And now you do what they told you. Now you're under control. Now you do what they
But I don't know, this idea that you're not bound by what's happened to you, that you're not bound by how other people have treated you. That is fascinating, but then also the counter to that again, that we have this tendency to rein it in, like we talk about UN peace talks, whatever, or we just talked about the Ascension, and I think it was the same kind of thing. After the wall came down, there was like a year or two where everything was possible. You could suddenly walk around with an Eastern and West German passport, and borders were open, and people were getting jobs and doing things. And then,
and how did that feel? I mean, can you just describe that a little bit? Because it's not an experience that either of us have gone through. So you grew up in a certain situation, and then you went to America. I mean,
I mean,
how was that?
I don't know. Obviously, I was a teenager, so I didn't have this kind of worries that you would have as an adult. What happens to my job and those kind of things. But it was intoxicating. It was exhilarating. I mean, this idea that, I remember distinctly on a class trip to Berlin, standing behind the wall, thinking, you're not going to be able to cross this until you're 65. Because then they let you go. Like when you were on the state's pension scheme, you were free to travel in the hopes that you might stay somewhere else.
Oh, really?
You were no longer a laborer. You no longer had to pay in, and so your grandparents and others, they were actually free to travel and then visit relatives in the West or whatever. We had people come over, but it was very clear. And if you're like 13 or so, you're thinking like that's a million years away. And of course you hear and read. We had bits and bobs and music that we would exchange because we had West German television and radio and all of that, and some stuff came in. And of course you also imagine the West being so much happier because they have much, much better Lego, or they have Lego. I mean, so because you have no experience of that world. And then, well, the demonstrations had been going on in Leipzig for the whole summer. We knew that something was happening when, on the 9th of October, so exactly a month before the wall came down, where they had warned, there's going to be tanks on the street. We've seen this in Prague in 1963. East Germany in 1963. We've seen it in Prague in 1950, whenever it was. We've just seen it in Tiananmen Square that spring, what that looks like. So don't go into the city. They will shoot. And nothing happened. So the tanks were there, but no shot was fired, and the demonstrations grew. And I was in one of that demonstrations between that moment and the wall coming down. And there was already that kind of degree, like you can make your demands heard. We yelled at the Stasi building. It was 300,000 people together. I mean, it was amazing. And then I came home one day, I think I was in some church meeting, some youth thing or whatever, or choir or whatever it was. Came home and parents sitting in front of the TV and looking at me, it's like the wall came down, like, what? Like, it was just unbelievable. And then watching people and watching those trubbies go through and hugging at the wall, and like, it was intoxicating, like, like winning the world championship 10 times over. Just this really collective moment where everybody just gets really involved, and they're visiting West Germany for the first time, then also kind of sharing with one another, what did you buy, and that kind of stuff, like really just diving into something that was inaccessible to you. And then of course later on you realize, well, how stupid was that? Like West Germany gave you like 100 marks and you bought some silly little thing, and they carted all these silly little things in these villages by the border because all these Germans came over to buy some sort of commercial thing, which is also interesting when you think about it, that those were the expressions of freedom. And the intellectuals in East Germany, they suffered under this. They said, like, this was about thinking about a different system. This was about the environment. This was about injustice. These guys were clued in the anti-apartheid battle, and, this was all liberation theology. And then what the people wanted was bananas and traveling to Mallorca.
And Lego.
And that's what they got. And within a couple of years, so that was the critique of it. But I think on the whole, for me as a youth growing up, it was remarkable because, like you said, Leah, I mean, like 2 years later, I was in exchange in the US, and my world was just radically opening up, and it continued. We had Schengen come in Europe, so borders were falling, like. East Germany opens up, you still have to show your passport going to Austria, Switzerland, whatever, Netherlands. And that just all fell. And all of a sudden, this place that you thought of as nation states of limitations, you could just move to wherever and work there. It isn't to be undercounted, but at the same time, it's also not what you imagine it to be in terms of happiness, fulfillment. Because very quickly you realize, well, there's no such thing as a free lunch, right?
Yeah. And do you think that there's a line between the people who are now kind of really going into the sort of right-wing politics in East Germany and that experience of a freedom that perhaps wasn't quite all it was cracked up to be, or is it just about the economics and about there being so much less in the way of economic development in the East still?
It's a tricky subject because I think there's multiple reasons for it. And I don't think it's just one thing. I don't think it's a disappointment with freedom because almost all people do not want East Germany back the way it was. There were some who say we didn't want this kind of capitalism. There's some who said we should have looked for a third way. But there's nobody who says, let's bring back the wall so that our economy is protected. Like, that just doesn't ring true to people. I think for me, it's two things. One is exactly the sort of the economy and sort of the way West Germany then bought everything out. So that freedom was hard earned in the generation of my parents, that everything that they worked for was worth absolutely nothing. It came free to West Germans to buy. You could buy whole factories for a symbolic Deutschmark to shut down and then turn these pieces of property into something profit-making years and years later.
Right.
So it became a place of consumption. You had to get used to much higher prices. But at the same time, there's a lot of lecturing going on, saying, well, this is how democracy works. You guys have a democracy deficit. And people are like, you had no idea what our life was like. The hard political choices we had to make. Yes, we didn't grow up in your system, but we were every bit as political. We had other intriguing issues to solve and to deal with in our dealings with the state. So this kind of being talked down to is one thing. The other thing I think is that East Germany was living in denial about the racism that was there, because there was always this sense that we had denazified more than the West, which was true to some extent because they brought in communists, which were persecuted by the Nazis, whereas in the West, the top echelon was like liberation fighters, social democrats or Christian democrats, whatever. But then beneath that, there was a lot of people who were just people of the system before. Like the sort of change wasn't as radical as it was in the East, where you had to like show your cards as a communist. As a communist. And that also meant that there was denial. Like, we live in this new utopian world where our African brother countries are just as equal as we are, whereas de facto your students from Mozambique or from Ethiopia or also further afield from Cuba or whatever, they were segregated. There was a lot of everyday kind of racism or racist jokes, and nobody would pick up on that because officially that didn't exist. And it was really depressing to see how quickly in Leipzig Nazi flags appeared at the Monday demonstrations. Like, it took weeks and they were there.
Wow.
And it was like, where did they come from? And within, months or just a few years, you would have street battles between left and right wing groups. And they had like the cities. So the economic dislocation and the lack of multicultural exposure, because whatever there was closeted off, and there was no talking about it. I had no child of another color in my class, and where they were absolutely rare. Like, you talk about them. Like, the most diverse I remember was people from Hungary, and who had a sort of a traveling past or something like that. That was pretty diverse already. So the lack of that, economic dislocation, then a lot of sort of migration coming in the years after is what's happening now. And the fact that there's now a party that has discovered that old recipe of looking pretty normal on one side and hosting all the right-wing extreme Nazis on the other, like winking to them while looking respectable and professorial even in some wings of the party to others. So that's a very long story anyway.
Yeah, sorry, it was a huge question, but it is.
I think it does.
Really interesting.
It does lead us into the question of, in Western democracy, capitalist Western democracies, we talk about freedom as being the kind of the principle on which a lot of that stuff is founded. I guess not just freedom, also like equal treatment for all. But that idea that the freedom that East Germany got was for West Germans to come and buy stuff really cheap, buy their stuff. It kind of rings true a little bit with the complaints that some of us have about capitalism now, right?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's interesting because we have these sort of twin themes, don't we, of the West and democracy and freedom. And what we're sometimes careful to do is to say, well, yeah, we'll bring you democracy, but actually what democracy means is you get to vote once every 4 years.
Yeah.
It doesn't necessarily come with all those other things that we all know actually work to make democracy, like a free press and an independent judiciary and strong civil organisations and all the rest of it. So we've narrowed down democracy to a very small thing that happens once every 4 years. And then we've done a bit the same with freedom. It's kind of like the West will give you freedom, but it's freedom that's very, very constrained by your economic ability. So yes, in theory, you could buy all this stuff, you could move to live here, you could get this education, you could have this kind of healthcare, but increasingly that freedom to choose is not available to everybody because they don't have the economic.
Well, it's become a slogan, right? It's become a slogan of the free world. It just kind of means a certain kind of people.
Well, the free world. I mean, what does the free world mean? I mean, that's just a thing in itself, isn't it?
I mean, I don't want to live in Russia. I don't want to live in China.
I don't want to live in Russia either. But equally, I wouldn't want to be really, really poor in America or Britain. You know, it's not a fun way to be, is it?
But in America, you can get freedom fries.
Oh, so that's all right. So you can buy your freedom fries. You probably afford those because they're bad for you. And
that's what the Congress renamed theirs when. Remember that when George W. Bush did not get his Iraq coalition, and the French and the Germans said, "We're not joining you for that." In protest against the French, they renamed the French fries into freedom fries, and then you could really see how hollow the notion of freedom had become. But I mean, and that's really funny and interesting because we use freedom in the sense, and we don't really, and coming back to where we started, we don't know what we mean. So the question we have to ask is freedom from what and freedom to what, right? And I think the wall coming down was a definite freedom from particular levels of oppression, And that's what made it so exciting. Like, you were free from those shackles that kept you locked up, free from having to say things in school you don't believe, free from being sent down trajectories you didn't want to go down to simply because you didn't fit in and whatever, and job-wise. And also freedom from some forms of economic limitations, but the freedom too was unclear. Like, you thought it was a freedom to buy everything and then enjoy this consumption, and that really wasn't, that didn't play out. Like, and I remember how I was very spiritual at that point too, and I felt it was sad how when before the wall came down, we had to decide like when to exercise our freedom in Christ, like in school or something. We would have conversations, like people, I remember this one family, there was one way of getting out in East Germany. You could apply to leave the country, to lay down your citizenship and emigrate. And for that, they would put you through the ringer. They would threaten to take your children away. You would lose your job. You would be, and he was some, I don't know, he worked in some factory as some engineer or something of that sort. They made him cleaner. And the children were brought into the principal's office and asked whether they really want to go. Do they agree with their parents? So they had to kind of rehearse these situations at home, right? So those are the kinds of things that you were contending with inside. So you knew where the oppression was.
Right.
And then when the wall came down, the conversations after church service was no longer how you doing, how's that been working out, or talking like, I don't know, like I have to kind of recite this poem that says, I don't believe in God. Do I really want that? Do I want to make a fuss? Like, all these are real problems. And like, oh, look, I just got this camera and look what it does. And it just felt like, and got this car. And it just kind of, I remember thinking like, that's it? Like, that's the freedom we now have? And that just didn't ring true. So there was a sense in which you had a clearer compass what freedom was when you were deprived of it. And in this kind of way of, as long as you have the money, you can buy what you want. Or if you don't have the money just yet, you can always hope that you will someday, that your ship will come in. It doesn't hold the same value somehow.
And doesn't the church have the same kind of issue in that we're quite clear that you're free, like I was describing, free from the hurts that were causing me to behave in certain ways. And I know genuine stories where people have been set free from addictions and all kind of things. But then there's free to what? Free to maybe Romans 8 is saying free to groan and to grapple with the problems of the world and to engage with them, but not from a place where you're still as much contributing to them, where you're freer to act in a different way within those problems. Is that it? Or free to still be in the same situation, so free to stay in the world and not separate yourself out and say, right now I'm free to just talk about my lovely Christian things all the time. But
right. Well, also free to actually put that Christianity into the world. Like, do we talk, like, of course we do it in sermons, but after, when we have our coffee, when we talk about our week, do we talk about the moral dilemmas we face? Do we talk about how can I see God's new creation coming in what I see around me? Or has this all been spiritualized away, and then it's this kind of freedom from sin, and we celebrate when people get free, and they're genuine, like you say, they're genuine transformations. But then the to what is like, well, now you go to church, like now you're part of the club. That's it. And then there's heaven, of course, afterwards. But in that space in between, what are we free for?
I'm really interested in that idea of like taking freedom, like going the extra mile, or choosing to decide whether or not you take up this calling or whatever. Like the idea of our kind of personal spiritual freedom, giving us a little bit of extra power to choose to be generous even if we're not sure we've got enough money to do that or whatever it is.
Well, the stuff that takes off is exactly that. That's driven by it. You know, like the community fridge. It's like, okay, how do we free ourselves from this idea that food will just go to waste? And this is how the economy allows, the supply chains must keep rolling. And that's inspirational, right? And I'm sure you can find those spaces, and there's lots of good stuff going on. I'd like to see more of that. Or, you know, is it how we do counseling, how we talk about, I don't know, our work?
And I think some of it is just changing the message in terms of why we do these things in church. So, there's a strong sense of kind of, oh, you need to do this because it's kind of what you need to do as a Christian, and you need to be part of this. It's kind of your Christian duty to help out on these occasions and these events. But,
yeah, I like that.
I feel like there's more. Are we telling that story that you have been set free in order to work that freedom out in your daily life? So that might mean getting your food from the community fridge. It might mean giving freely of your time in order to help other people. You're not doing it because kind of that's what Christians do. And I think there's probably a previous generation who were just like, they're just duty people, and they did stuff at church because they were meant to do stuff at church. But our generation and younger do not roll like that. And so I think we could do more in church to tell that story of why we do these things.
I like that.
Not in a way that makes people feel guilty, but it's part of us dancing and celebrating and enjoying the freedom that we have and how we can bring it more to be in the world.
Well, and also knowing the freedom from, right? I mean, like, it seems a little bit like once you become a Christian, you're like Jesus' disciples is, but we're children of Abraham. We've never been enslaved. And he's like, well, what are you talking about, right? So, like, then look at, like, where are you enslaved? Like, don't just spiritualize it. Don't just say, okay, then you pray. But what is it that is enslaving you right now? And what would that look like? And whether this is a relationship problem, whether this is an addiction, whether this is just the way you are forced to live, what would it be like to enact some acts of freedom from those circumstances and toward a different world?
Yeah, so this is making me think about, like, what are we enslaved to? Well, maybe capitalism, right? And then this is why things like the community fridge are such a great example, because the community fridge refuses capitalism, and it refuses the kind of charity within capitalism stuff that you get, like, oh, you're too poor, so I'm going to give you stuff out of my richness. And instead it says, no, we have a place where, like, really rich people come and get free food. And it doesn't matter how rich or poor you are, you can have this free food. And I like the refusal of capitalism that is in that.
I mean, do let the poor go first, but yeah, sorry.
I can't believe we've got this far through this discussion and we haven't talked about Exodus. Because, I mean, so the whole point is that they're captive in Israel, in Egypt. They come out and they have no idea what to do with their freedom. They have absolutely no idea. And so much so that they even go and see this promised land and have absolutely no idea how to do anything with it. And they can't, the whole 40 years in the wilderness is kind of a learning what it means to be free, right? To start to experience God's amazing provision.
I'm struggling with that because I don't see the story gets that much better when they get to the promised land. Like the
but you're hung up on all the fighting people and killing them and whatnot. But it was meant to be, and I know.
Well, also the judges, like they kind of fall away. It's like there's this. But
I know. I'm totally with you. But there was meant to be a vision of moving from enslavement to abundance, wasn't there? And it feels like the journey in the wilderness was a learning how to think about abundance.
Learning about independence and about what God is like.
And it was full of them going, we were better off in Egypt, where at least, we weren't free, but at least we had 3 meals a day or whatever they say. I can't remember. But I don't know. It's an idea.
Yeah, but that's an interesting one, because it also shows you that that our idea of freedom is basically one of personal security, having enough to eat,
right.
And it's not visionary. And like, to some extent, this is also then the East German story that a lot of the grumbling that arose later was like, well, what now? Like, we're not being taken care of better. The state, we could grumble against the state that we had before, and this state isn't feeding us either. And it's like, well, what is it you're going to do with that freedom? What is it you're going to do with that time? What do you want to live for in the end?
Don't know.
So it's about now that we kind of tidy everything up into a nice, neat ending.
Yeah, I don't think we do.
Well, this has been one of our neater episodes. I mean, it really has gone uphill from my Sudan
it has.
dilemma.
It has from mass death.
Well, what does it do with global justice?
Yeah, where do we get to with that? So if this freedom, part of this freedom is choosing to, like, name what's oppressing us or suppressing us, and taking the power to turn against it, even where it looks like we don't have it, but maybe we're buoyed up by the confidence that God is with us, and we take the power to resist in some surprising way, like with extra generosity or extra enemy loving or whatever. Does that get us anywhere with the global situation? We still need to buy fair trade coffee, right?
Well, I think there's an amount of looking at our life is an ongoing look at what are we doing that contributes to the enslavement of other people, isn't it? I mean, there's always more that you can.
But here's the thing with that.
More that you can do.
With both of those things. I mean, the one thing I always try and teach my students is that colonialism begins when you try and help. Like, many acts of colonialism, the reason they become popular, of course, there's your settlers, there's your industry, they want something. But they get the public along by saying, this is atrocious, you gotta help. I mean, the liberating of slaves in Africa is exactly what you need in order to get imperial control. Because this is what is used for sort of ethical motivation, and people come behind it. They think they can solve things for Africa and say, we'll bring you Christianity and commerce so you no longer need to take slaves. What I think we need to reckon with is that we maybe, in some cases, don't have those degrees of freedom that we'd like to imagine, we have in development when we go to other states and say, here's how you should do it, or that we like to think when we thought we just kick Arabs out of East Africa in order to end slavery and end up somehow colonizing those countries by accident. I am bound by conflicts where I have absolutely no input. Mm-hmm. Like there is a kind of an absence of freedom. It's not a slavery because I'm not affected. Like I can still walk away from it if I don't want to look at it. But as somebody, for example, we've talked about this on this podcast many times before, like who is closely connected with people in Ethiopia, who sees this pain, who sees this country kind of, who at least once a week I have a conversation around this, and everybody just shakes their head. We don't know what you can do, right? So is there something here where we need to actually face this degree of lack of freedom in order to begin to rethink what a creative response might look like? Because the white saviorism begins by saying, well, it's maybe I should buy a different coffee, or if I can only go to the House of Parliament to raise this cause. And I'm not saying these are wrong things, but the idea that that's the one thing you can and must do, and because of you, it's not better, and this is happening. There's absolutely nothing that's going to stop these people from RSF slaughtering and these in this racist ethnocentrism that they're doing that with, other than an army. And what then do you do? How do we acknowledge that lack of freedom?
If we stop seeing ourselves as masters of the universe, does that actually give us, in some sense, give us freedom to respond in a more realistic way?
Or does it do nothing? Like, I don't know. I mean, just...
Or to do nothing, yeah. But, like, can we respond... Is it easier for us to respond as, like, troublemakers if we stop seeing ourselves as rulers? Maybe that's good. I don't know.
Well, it certainly should lead you to ask more. I mean, I don't... Yeah. I mean, I'm constantly looking for people that you can ally with, who say the right things, whose voices that, whatever little it helps, one can help amplify or something. But it's like, when that's not there, when everybody gets bound up in this conflict, then I almost said all you can do is pray. But yeah, really in that sense of like, I have nothing to give.
Well, I mean, that's where Romans 8 kind of lands it, isn't it?
Is it groaning? Yeah. Yeah, you're right.
Searching in there. And yeah, maybe the starting point is we can still do stuff, but it's doing it with that attitude that says, I don't actually know if this is going to help.
I think quite often in Christianity there is a liberating lack of responsibility, right? That you can say, oh, I know that my job is just this and the rest is up to God. And what you mean by the rest is up to God is kind of open to interpretation, but saying I'm not in charge of everything. It's quite liberating.
Yeah, I mean, weirdly, at the end of that Romans passage is that verse that everybody pulls out of context. And we know that in all things, God works for the good of those who love him, who have been called according to his purpose.
I thought I'd broken Jörg with the fair trade comment, but I think maybe that's broken him.
Yeah, this one went a bit deeper, yeah.
All right, I think probably we should stop there. And Leah, I'm going to ask you...
I'm not sure that we can end just like that, can we?
Just on breaking Jörg.
Well, maybe we do need to, because what do you say? What do you say in the end when people can take children away from their parents and murder them in cold blood? I don't want to be free from that. And groaning is maybe the only answer that we have for that. And yeah, forget that last verse with the for the good of those who love him. But
where it all ends up good.
But saying, God, free us from ourselves, free us from humanity. I mean, like, thankfully we no longer have the racialized version of that you would say, well, that's not us. Because goodness, we've seen that we are every bit as capable of doing those kinds of things to one another, and that what I see in Africa is also somewhere deep in me. And there's, I think, the need to acknowledge our enslavement to fear, to greed, to susceptibility to all kinds of evil. I think that's perhaps a bit of freedom that we need to take, even if it's, if the idea is always, oh, no, if we just think about it right, we'll do better. And then hope that we can find creative ways to respond, to partner with people.
Yeah, and I think this is a poem by Maya Angelou, and I think it holds those things together really, really well. So it's a bit long, so you'll have to bear with, but I think it's worth it. She's such an amazing woman, and I still remember finding her books in the library as a teenager, and I just absolutely, they're kind of mainly autobiography. She's got kind of 7 or 8 volumes that charts her life, and she was, I was this kind of, this white English teenager, and her life was so different to mine, but yet so powerful and just...
Can you say a bit more about her life?
No, because I've probably mostly forgotten it, but she grew up in the States, but from a pretty humble beginning, and had an awful lot of trials and tribulations, but then became an actor and a poet and kind of, obviously now she's probably America's equivalent of a national treasure, and she spent some time living in Gambia sort of became part of that American diaspora that went back to sort of discover their roots and live in the newly liberated country. And yeah, just absolutely fascinating life, but really humble beginnings and really difficult childhood and background. And her first book, I think, is I Know Why the Caged Bird Sings.
Right.
Just amazing stories of hardship shot through with hope. And yeah, quite an amazing lady.
This generation going back to Africa, that's a whole another rabbit hole to talk about maybe another time. But like when you look at what happened to liberated slaves when they landed in Sierra Leone, or when you look at what then happened with the African Colonization Society that started Liberia, where then the children of former slaves were running a colony. Oh man. Yeah, freedom is complicated.
Yeah, freedom. I mean, this obviously, this is in the 70s or so. And
yeah, this is later.
I think it was Gambia or Senegal. I think it was Gambia. Yeah, it would be because Senegal's more French, isn't it? Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, anyway. Shall I read it?
Please.
Yes, please.
A brave and startling truth. We, this people, on a small and lonely planet travelling through casual space, past aloof stars, across the way of different suns to a destination where all signs tell us it is possible and imperative that we learn a brave and startling truth. And when we come to it, to the day of our peacemaking, when we release our fingers from fists of hostility and allow the pure air to cool our palms, when we come to it, when the curtain falls on the minstrel show of hate, the faces sooted with scorn are scrubbed clean. When battlefields and Colosseum no longer rake our unique and particular sons and daughters, up with the bruised and bloody grass to lie in identical plots in foreign soil. When the rapacious storming of the churches, the screaming racket in the temples have ceased. When the pennants are waving gaily, when the banners of the world tremble stoutly in the good clean breeze, when we come to it, when we let the rifles fall from our shoulders and children dress their dolls in flags of truce, when landmines of death have been removed and the aged can walk into evenings of peace, when religious ritual is not performed by the incense of burning flesh and childhood dreams are not kicked awake by nightmares of abuse. When we come to it, then we will confess that not the pyramids with their stones set in mysterious perfection, nor the gardens of Babylon hanging as eternal beauty in our collective memory, not the Grand Canyon kindled into delicious colour by western sunsets, not the Danube flowing its blue soul into Europe, not the sacred peak of Mount Fuji stretching to the rising sun, neither Father Amazon nor Mother Mississippi, who without favour nurture all creatures in the depths and on the shores. These are not the only wonders of the world. When we come to it, we, this people on this minuscule and kithless globe, who reach daily for the bomb, the blade and the dagger, yet who petition in the dark for tokens of peace, we, these people on this mote of matter, in whose mouths abide cankerous words which challenge our very existence, yet out of those same mouths come songs of such exquisite sweetness that the heart falters in its labour and the body is quieted into awe. We, this people on this small and drifting planet, whose hands can strike with such abandon that in a twinkling life is sapped from the living, yet those same hands can touch with such healing, irresistible tenderness, that the haughty neck is happy to bow and the proud back is glad to bend. Out of such chaos, of such contradiction, we learn that we are neither devils nor divines. When we come to it, we, this people, on this wayward floating body, created on this earth, of this earth, have the power to fashion for this earth a climate where every man and every woman can live freely, without sanctimonious piety, without crippling fear. When we come to it, we must confess that we are the possible, we are the miraculous, the true wonder of this world. That is when, and only when, we come to it.
Thank you, Leah.
Thank you.
So, listener, thank you for putting up with us again. Your homework this week is to carry out a free act or an act of freedom. See you next time.
Kill it in the name of. Kill it in the name of. Kill it in the name of.
You've been listening to Justice Warriors. You can subscribe wherever you get your podcasts, and you can also follow us on social media by searching for Justice Warriors, where warrior is spelt like someone who worries about things. If you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe and leave us a rating, since that helps other people find us. Also, please tell your friends about us in real life. We'd love to hear from you. To get in touch, use the email address in the show notes or contact us via the social media links. Thanks for listening.
Now you do what they told you. And now you do what they told you.